The world that science recognizes, using its instruments of the sensory instruments, cannot accommodate what we are now terming as spirituality. I think it is a shame that in India, which is so rich in its knowledge traditions across so many disciplines, from mathematics to health sciences to agriculture to metallurgy, to architecture, that we don't use this.
Yeah.
Fortunately for us, in the recent national education policy of 2020, which just got accepted, Professor Kasturirangan's committee has recognized the fact that India has a rich cultural intellectual heritage which has made great contributions to the world of knowledge. And if we build on Indian knowledge systems, I think India can make remarkable contributions to the world of knowledge, not as it did in the past by zero and infinity, which became the foundation of mathematics.
Right.
But today you can build and create new contributions to the world of knowledge in a number of fields.
Right.
Certainly I see in health sciences that India can propose a new theory for pathogenesis.
Welcome to part 3 of Vishwas In Conversation with Padma Shri Darshan Shankar, Vice-Chancellor of the Trans-Disciplinary University. In last two, part 1 and part 2, we talked about Shankar's lifescape. In this particular part of the Vishwas In Conversation with Darshan, we are going to talk about some of the issues that interest both of us. And let's start with the first issue, the link between science and spirituality. Shankar, much of the work that you do is closely associated with the traditional knowledge. And the moment people think of traditional knowledge, they think that this is a bygone era, this is not an advanced knowledge, this is something to deal with religion. I thought this is the best opportunity for either of us to clarify the inherent linkages between the science and spirituality.
Vishwas, this is actually a knowledge question. It is not a matter of personal opinion regarding relationship between science and spirituality. Both science and spirituality are different dimensions of nature. They both use different lenses. So just to give you an example, let's say microbiologist, then the lens that one uses is, of course, the instrument of the microscope, and the only world that one perceives through that instrument is the microscopic world. To ask a dedicated microbiologist who's not aware of any other dimension of nature a question about stars and planets, he would say they don't exist, because using the lens of microscopy, you can only see the microbial world. So science and spirituality are different dimensions of nature. If you use the lens of science, which is a lens which uses sensory data, all the instruments of science are extensions of the 5 senses. And therefore, when you use instruments that are of that nature, sensory, they pick up sensory data. Now, that sensory data of the physical world, of the biological world, is what science picks up. And it analyzes this data in a rational way, in a logical way. It needs tools like mathematics, of course, logic, statistics, these days, big data analysis, and so on and so forth. Because the amount of data that you can collect with these tools can be enormous. In genomics, for example, you can get just enormous data when you are doing gene sequencing. The world that science recognizes, using its instruments of the sensory instruments, cannot accommodate what we are now terming as spirituality. You cannot detect anything to do with the spirit or anything subtle like that with sensory instrument. Even the mind, which one might is a subtle thing, so far as hardcore science is concerned, mind is only a notion, it's a term. What exists is the brain, and therefore all terms like fear or love or anxiety, which may be mental attributes, are to the biologists neural configurations of neural configurations that you can detect in different parts of the brain. There is, to hardcore biology, no such thing as mind as a separate entity. You can refer to it in language, but the mind and the brain are one and the same. Now, this is the scientific lens at work, and this is the scientific view of nature. In spirituality, one is now not using the scientific lens at all. One does not discover the spiritual dimension of nature using the five senses. In fact, what one uses is the mind, but not the mind in its analytical and in its rational state, but in what we call, at least in Indian tradition, in the Yoga Shastras, the mind is a distinct entity from the brain and is separable from the body. You can separate it from the body. And in the yogic lens and in the yogic methods of knowing, you have just for all of nature, but I give you an example of human being. The human being, from a scientific perspective, is only a physical and biological entity. However, when you are looking at the same human being from the perspective of yogic knowledge system, then this entire external body is only referred to as the Annamaya Kosha, a layer that is formed by food, by Annamaya Kosha. And there are 4 other layers of a human being. Now, if a scientist and a yogi, get into a discourse, and the scientist says, look, what are you talking about, these other koshas, Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, and so on and so forth. What are you talking about? Can you show these to me? When he says, can you show this to me? Can you give me evidence about the existence? What he's asking for is sensory evidence. So coming back to my example of a dedicated microbiologist who, let us say, hypothetically only understands and is dedicated to the microbial world, to him, the cosmic world doesn't exist. The planetary world doesn't exist. And so if you ask a microbiologist, can you show me the stars? Can you show me the planets? He'll say, what nonsense are you talking about? They don't exist. All that exists in nature are microbes, because that's all that he focuses on. And therefore, when there is a dialogue between a yogi or a person in the yogic sciences or knowledge system, if you don't want to use the word science there, the yogic knowledge system versus the scientific knowledge system. To the scientific knowledge system, there is no such thing as subtle states of the body. There is only the biophysical body. no other state of body exists. Now, if there is a tolerance in the dialogue, just as if there were tolerance between an astrophysicist and a microbiologist could be well aware that while his world is a microbial world, there is another world of, stars and planets, and that there are methods to find out about that world. There are instruments to find out about that world. And so he would say, while I personally don't understand much about astronomy, I know that there exists a dimension of nature in which you can see stars and planets. Now, this is because there is an awareness, firstly, and there is a tolerance. If there were a dialogue similarly between a yogi and a scientist, and if there was tolerance, then the scientist could say, look, I don't know what is the spiritual world that you talk about, all these different layers of a human being, for example. And they're not only about human being, they are also about all biophysical dimensions that you can detect. Eye science also have all these other dimensions, subtle dimensions of being. A plant also has a so-called pranamaya kosha, and so on and so forth. I gave the example of human. Now, this is very clear in the yogic knowledge system. It is not detectable in the scientific knowledge system. So the question of science and spirituality is a knowledge question. And depending on, the kind of knowledge that you are familiar with, you will accept or reject. Depending on your tolerance, you might say, I don't know, but perhaps there is a spiritual world. I don't know about it. I've heard about it, but I don't know. If you are intolerant, you'll say, no, it doesn't exist. All that exists is only what I can see with my lenses. Now, this, I think, is a little unreasonable because, nature is very, very complex. Nature has so many dimensions. We keep discovering within our own domains. I mean, there was a time when nanoparticles, may not have existed to conventional chemistry. But today we know that they exist. And we know in the evolution of, different domains, but taking chemistry itself, or in physics, there was a time when Newtonian physics was all that was real about physical change, until the quantum perspective came about post-Einstein and so on and so forth. And so these kinds of changes can happen even within a particular domain. And certainly given the complexity of nature, I mean, at least to my view, while I am discussing science, I would not like to improperly mix up dimensions of metaphysics into science. But I think that you can put on both lenses. If you are into my mind, if you are well educated, you can subscribe to both yoga as well as to biophysical sciences. I mean, there is no contradiction between the two. They're just two different dimensions of nature.
That's absolutely something that the whole intention behind asking this question was that these are the two different knowledge systems. They exist in their own rights. But this kind of haste to denounce one for the other is something that we as a society and we as a scientific diaspora needs to overcome. The moment somebody speaks about spirituality as a knowledge system or a science of sensory feelings of his or her own ecosystem or his or her own domain, is ridiculed or denounced or looked upon in a negative way by a mainstream science or a current science?
There is a reason for this. And the reason is that while sensory data is very visible to the senses when it is direct sensory perception, it is also very visible and measurable to the instruments of science. And so, in that sense, it appears to be reliable, real, whereas when one is in the spiritual, examining the spiritual dimension of nature, then one no longer has these so-called instruments, which can objectify physical or biological reality. And so we say, look, that spiritual knowledge is not objective. It is not objective in the sense of it being visible to the senses or to the instruments of the senses, and therefore there is a difficulty in communication. That when I say and describe a spiritual phenomena, when I say there is an existence of the pranamaya kosha. Now, someone says, can you show me that pranamaya kosha? Now, when he is saying, can you show me that pranamaya kosha, his anticipation is that you will be able to show it to him in a physical or in a biological form. It's a metaphysical form. So how do you show someone a metaphysical form? Now, the only instrument to know and cognize a metaphysical form is actually your own mind. And your own mind, and when I say your own mind, I'm not referring to the brain. In the yogic knowledge system, the brain and the mind are distinct. They work in conjunction. You can certainly see emotions reflected in neural patterns, but the mind is treated, and is not just treated conceptually, but is experientially known to be a distinct entity. A yogi can separate, so to say, his pranamaya kosha from his annamaya kosha. But again, this is what he claims. For the observer who's observing this, he would say, look, where is that pranamaya kosha? Where did it go? How did you, how do I know whether you separated it out or you didn't?
Yeah.
And so one has to rely on, your own experience. Now, here subjectivity becomes, this whole discussion on what is objective and what is subjective. Right. In science, you try to solve the problem of subjectivity and objectivity, because what is objective is really the instrument. I mean, when a microscope with imagery in it takes the photograph of a microbial entity, it is the output of an instrument. Okay, the mind cannot see, nor the brain nor the eye can see that particular microbe. I see it because this instrument has the capacity to photograph it, to image it. The fMRI can look at neural circuits in the brain and so on and so forth. So we rely on instrumentation for objectivity. And, in the debate and discourse on subjectivity and objectivity in science, you may have a very objective instrument, but that is no guarantee that your value system or your subjective state is objective. You may choose the wrong kind of a problem because of your bias or because of your orientation. Instrument cannot help you to choose your problem. So in yoga, we say, look, there is no distinction between subject and object. And the subject and the object become one. And it's a matter of really experience. This is the difficulty. This is the difficulty in communication, because the only way to appreciate the spiritual dimensions of nature is through your own experience. And your own experience through training. You have to train to be a yogi. If someone were to approach a yogi and say, look, I want to experience the pranamaya kosha, can you teach me? He will say, yes, I can teach you how to experience your pranamaya kosha, provided you learn pranayama and advanced pranayama. And I can tell you that if you are sincere, in as much as even in science, I mean, I cannot use a microscope, unless I'm trained to do so. I cannot use any sophisticated instrument unless I'm trained to do so. So if one undergoes that training, then one will be able to experience it. But to dismiss it because you cannot experience it and because there are no objective instruments to capture metaphysical reality is, again, to me, I see the difficulty, but to dismiss it and to reject it, I see the difficulty, is intolerance. I mean, the least that you can say is perhaps it is true. Perhaps if I decide that I want to learn yoga and dedicate time to it, maybe I will discover this dimension of nature. But today I'm not prepared to do so, nor should I be prepared to pass a judgment on it. Mm-hmm. The other difficulty is that there is, just as in science, just as in medicine, there is a lot of quackery. There are a lot of people deceiving other people, saying this is what I discovered in this subtle dimension. Now, who knows what you discovered? Because I didn't discover it, I didn't experience it. So I have to rely on your judgment. There is also a sociological problem in this whole discourse between science and spirituality. That particularly in a culturally rich society like India, the heritage, many scientists face a personal problem. My father, let's say, passed away. As per tradition, I'm supposed to do a pitru puja or a ritual that will be good for the departed spirit. Now, I'm a scientist, and my problem is, should I do this or should I not? As per my knowledge system, there is no such thing as a pitru. There is no such thing as a departed spirit. What ritual am I going to do for the salvation or for the progression of my pitrus? So I face this dilemma as a scientist. And some scientists are hardcore and they say, sorry, we won't participate in any of our traditional rituals. And some scientists, work in two dimensions. They say, when we are doing science, we will use the methods of science to understand biological and physical reality as understood by the senses. It is partial knowledge. It is reductionist in its nature. So be it. But it has, applications, and we will apply them. But they are also open, just as in the example of the microbiologist and the astrophysicist. They are also open to the other dimension. Some of them even venture into that dimension. And you can have a scientist who's a yogi. Yogis, of course, are open to science because they know that there is a reality in the plane of biological and physical plane. There is a reality there. So they are open. Some scientists can also be open, and they are in fact not just open, but they may be also yogis. But the yogi doesn't use the methods of science.
To explain, or to help other person to
discover spiritual reality. Because it's a complex It's a complex area.
And I have this hypothesis all along, uh, is that one is self-experiential. Spirituality is self-experiential. The another one has instrument and mechanisms where it can be explained to another individual. So the dichotomy is between enhancing your own ability to experience the uh, inner universe and understand the truth of the principles that builds the inner universe, and the other one is to simply being rational and simply being observant and simply being able to explain it into the forms of figures and datas and sensory feelings and such like that. So I often tend to believe that there has to be an equal respect to one or the other. And as you rightly said, the one who is truly yogic in nature, respect and accept that yes, there is a scientific knowledge, there is data out there, and based on this, there are some hypotheses proven. Uh, and I guess increasingly that similar realization must come for the science of spirituality or understanding of spirituality.
Yes, they are different dimensions of nature. They are different dimensions of nature. That's all.
Yeah.
And one dimension is more accessible. You know, the physical and biological dimension is more accessible. The subtler dimensions of nature are more difficult to access because you don't have the advantage of instruments.
Indian knowledge system. And we have spoken about it in a previous part. But I somewhere felt that there's much need to be talked about it. In a current circumstances, current situations where we are dealing with a pandemic, we are dealing with mental trauma, everybody is in a phase of uncertainty. There is a sense of fear all around. And sometimes we fear ourselves, sometimes we fear the situations, and sometimes we fear about the other person. Given all of this, the direct question that I wanted to pose you is the significance of Indian knowledge system in A, overcoming the unknown attack like COVID pandemic, and B, in overcoming all of these fear-based understanding of life.
You see, the first thing for us to appreciate, particularly in these days, I mean, in this century, is that knowledge is a cultural product. And different cultures have generated knowledge systems. In the earlier discussion, science is a cultural product. Yoga knowledge system is also a cultural product, and they are both products of cultures. Now, what has happened is that mature knowledge systems may have universal values. So someone would say, why do you call science, for example, as a Western society's knowledge product? Because it is equally applicable in Eastern society, in African society, in Chinese society, anywhere in the world. It has universal principles, it has universal values. And so we get confused because we think that only one knowledge system has universal values. Certainly, by no chance can one concede that the monopoly of universality lies only within the scientific knowledge system. The scientific knowledge system certainly has universal values. It has its own limitations because of its reductionist approach, its observer-observed framework. which separates the observer from the observed. And so therefore you always will get a reduced view of reality of nature. But many other knowledge systems from different cultures also have universal values. The monopoly of science in our education system has made people think that if some knowledge is not scientific, it is totally invalid knowledge. Now, I'm saying scientific in the sense of the technicalities of science, the methods of science. But this is not true. There can be a knowledge system which is not scientific. So, for example, Ayurveda as a health science is not scientific. It does not have a molecular perspective of biological change. It does not have a cellular perspective of biological change. It observes change in terms of fields. Those fields are called the Pancha Mahabhutas. It observes change in those fields. And it manages human biological change, constructing on a field theory, the theory of Panchamahabhutas, the theory of Kapha, Vata, Pitta, the three doshas. It constructs a knowledge system not based on an atomic, molecular, cellular perspective, but based on this field perspective. Now, the test of a knowledge system is not really, whether it works. There are bound to be differences between a field perspective and a molecular perspective. So, if you refer to COVID, now COVID from a molecular perspective is a viral condition. It is caused by a virus. Is it caused by a virus? Yes, it's caused by a virus. We know the virus, and in that molecular perspective, in that scientific perspective, it is the virus which is the cause of COVID. And therefore, to solve the problem of COVID in that system of knowledge, you need antivirals. Now, from an Indian health science perspective, we don't understand virus, we don't understand microbes, we don't have a molecular perspective, we don't have the same perspective as modern science. We have a field perspective. To us, COVID would be diagnosed in terms of the changes it is bringing about in Kapha, Vata, Pitta. These are expressions of that field perspective. Now, if the argument happens that, look, Kapha, Vata, Pitta doesn't look to have any correlation with virus, and therefore, even if you have a solution which is Kapha, Vata, Pitta, because of the argument you're making that you have an intervention that will modulate Kapha, Vata, Pitta, I reject it because it has got nothing to do with virus. It cannot have anything to do with virus. It's a different cultural product. Mm-hmm. What you have to see is, does it work? Do the symptoms of COVID, which I attribute to changes in a systemic framework of your body, do those symptoms change? Do they get rectified? Do they get mitigated? That is the test. We argue on the plane of epistemology, on the plane of the mode of action. And you take the mode of action and you take the argumentation from one knowledge system and expect another knowledge system to have exactly the same mode of action. And no, you can have many ways to go to Rome. There is not one road to Rome. Finally, have you reached Rome or no? That's the question. So can you solve mild and moderate symptoms of COVID by a completely different strategy and approach which views biology in a systemic way? It has a field perspective. So much of the difficulty is really that our policymakers and our systems of knowledge management. I mean, take the Department of Science and Technology, the Department of Biotechnology, or whatever, all CSIR and so on and so forth. They are all founded on science and the promotion of modern science.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think in a country like India, you should have all these departments. While science works, and works within its strengths, within its limitations, these very departments should broaden the meaning of science and say not only that science, not only that understanding of nature, which was, learned from Western cultural intellectual tradition, but why can't I understand nature from an Indian cultural and intellectual tradition, which is the Panchamahabhut Siddhant, which is the Tridosh Vichar. And if you want evidence, the evidence will not be found in trying to equate virus with Tridoshas. That is not the proposition. You will have to find evidence by saying, does it work or does it not work? And then that's a much more complex thing to correlate atoms, molecules, this approach with the Panchamahabhutas. Because one is a field theory. I meant to equate Newtonian physics with quantum physics. I mean, you can say one is a subset of the other or something. But there's not a one-to-one correlation, between the two, because their frameworks are different. And so we don't have enough of knowledge dialogue where there is a need. And I certainly think that there is a great contemporary relevance of Indian knowledge systems. Certainly in the field that I work in, which is the health sciences, we can see it every day that we are solving problems by a completely different theoretical approach, by a completely different practical approach. And we use Tridosh Vichar, we use Panchamahabhut Siddhant to detect biological change that is happening in health and in disease. And our solutions are based on a pharmacology that is not chemistry and biology, but it is a completely different pharmacology called Dravyaguna Shastra. And based on that pharmacology, we design drugs and formulations. And finally, the test is that it works. I mean, no one would come to the Indian health sciences for the sake of allegiance to tradition. People come if they get results, if they get relief. No one will go to a yoga center to learn pranayama unless they get, something improved in the state of their mind, in the state of their metabolism, because they're all connected. These are psychosomatic conditions. And so they work, but they don't work by the same method. They don't work in terms of the same logic. You cannot describe their mode of action in terms of molecular, cellular, atomic change. It is field changes. It is systemic changes. I think it is a shame that in India, which is so rich in its knowledge traditions across so many disciplines, from mathematics to health sciences, to agriculture, to metallurgy, to architecture, that we don't use this.
Yeah.
Fortunately for us, in the recent national education policy of 2020, which has just got accepted, Professor Kasturi Gangan's committee has recognized the fact that India has a rich cultural intellectual heritage, which has made great contributions to the world of knowledge. I happen to have one-to-one dialogue with Professor Kasturi Rangan, and I pleaded with him, saying, look, can you modify your paragraph in the national education policy and don't only refer to the value of Indian knowledge systems as historical contributions. you should really propose their application for contemporary value, for contemporary relevance, for contemporary applications. There has been a gap of almost 150 years due to colonialism, where the progression of Indian knowledge systems was interrupted. And as I said in my last interview with you, that we have such a huge misunderstanding about tradition and modernity. We think that they are at two ends of the spectrum. Actually, modernity is evolving tradition. Just as the past, present, and future lie on a continuum. There can be no present without a past. There can be no future without a present. There can be no modernity without tradition. Now, you may borrow from someone else's tradition as well. You may reject parts of your own tradition. That's all right. I mean, we're not saying that you have to follow tradition the way it was. There can be changes, but you have to build on your past. You have to build on your tradition. And if we build on Indian knowledge systems, I think India can make remarkable contributions to the world of knowledge, not as it did in the past, by zero and infinity, which became the foundations of mathematics.
Right.
But today you can build and create new contributions to the world of knowledge in a number of fields.
Right.
Certainly I see in health sciences that, India can propose a new theory for pathogenesis, the progression of disease. In biology, we know a healthy cell, we know a diseased cell. We don't know how, what is the progression, what is the way a healthy cell turns into a diseased cell. We don't know that pathway. In Ayurveda, we have a theory of pathogenesis. It is called Shad Kriya Kal. That means disease happens in 6 stages. And you can detect a disease 6 stages before it finally gets into its full-blown form. Now, if molecular biologists and Ayurveda people trained in Shad Kriya Kal work together, we may produce tomorrow a new theory of pathogenesis, which is based on Ayurveda biology. So, I mean, this is just an example, but there are many, many areas.
Absolutely.
I mean, in which we can make contribution if we apply Indian knowledge systems. This is in health sciences, I'm saying, but you could do it in architecture, you could do it in mathematics, you could do it even in metallurgy, you could do it in a number of...
agricultural science, for that matter.
Agricultural sciences.
Even the
definitely now we are rediscovering.
Yeah.
Yes, we are rediscovering. And it's not that, in agriculture it is yield versus the quality. You can try and achieve both by an integration of both the knowledge systems.
As you rightly said, that it is the right time for we as a nation to continue to explore the complementarities of both the knowledge systems, the mainstream European-based traditional science knowledge system and the Indian knowledge system. You are somebody who did not apply for the job. You somebody who does not wear your attire is uncommon. Is that your attire or your style of living you chose, or it happened naturally?
I think it happened more or less in some sense naturally. Naturally meaning there was an age when I was very enamored by Western lifestyle. I still enjoy food from many cultures, but even in terms of dress and so on and so forth. But then I suddenly found it very, very loud and somehow disagreeable. And I'm saying naturally because I find that simplification in everything is very, very important. You can complicate something by, I think that science, for example, as an enterprise, is itself a very complicated enterprise. You are trying to capture life in a laboratory. You study nature in a laboratory. Can you really do so? You can, but you can do it to a very reduced effect. So the whole enterprise of science has limitations because you cannot capture the diversity of life processes. You cannot simulate them. You cannot replicate them. In any number of biological experiments, in bioassays, or in, even we try in physical experiments, the cyclotron and so on and so forth. But the complexity of what happens in the cosmos, you can simulate it to that extent only, It's too complex to bring it. And so you can get some ideas, you can get, and you do get them, no doubt about it. But it's better to study nature directly, and Indians did find a way, apparently, of studying nature directly. We didn't have a tradition of creating these kinds of artificial. It's a great complexity to create a laboratory, with such heavy instrumentation and so on and so forth, and they overwhelm you really when you enter an advanced laboratory. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, if you really ask the scientists, to what extent does this actually simulate the reality of biological or physical life? To what extent? 10%, 20, 30, 40, certainly not 100. There's no way in which you can get, the only way you'll get 100% is to interact with life, to interact with nature as it is. So you can use these simulation exercises. They are complex ways of studying nature, but I am becoming more and more convinced that Indian genius must look at ways which I don't know, unfortunately, because I'm not educated enough, must discover ways in which the Indians studied astronomy, in which the Indians studied biology. And did they study astronomy? They did. You can read textbooks of on the subject, and they have been quoted actually in British archives, for example, that you knew about the 7 rings of Saturn in a century where there were no telescopes.
True.
Now, there's no way in which, through conventional science, you can look at those 7 rings at that distance without the aid of a telescope. How did the Indians discover those 7 rings that have been described? The British archives quote this particular reference from a text, Indian Sanskrit text, and they say, we don't know, it's a mystery. Now, we need to look at that mystery not through random speculation. And, you have to be disciplined even in that speculation.
Sure.
There is no need for us to say that we knew about the atom long before, because there is some notion that there are particles like Anu and Parmanu. But the modern understanding, or the physical understanding, the chemical understanding of atoms is with the instruments is quite profound,
Right.
And I don't think the Indians ever had that kind of instrumentation. But that is not the only way to look at the rings of Saturn, apparently. The telescope is not the only way. There have been other ways. It's evident from the literature. When I look at health sciences, one is amazed at the way we diagnose conditions, the way we treat conditions without the aid of a pathological laboratory. Now we need to rediscover those roots. We need to rediscover, Indian logic, which, as I cited to you in my last interview, that, even a Raja Ramanna
Right.
who started looking at Indian logic, said it is more sophisticated than all the logic that I used in physics.
Right.
Now, we have to take Indian knowledge system seriously,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to create centers of excellence around them, and not isolated. You bring them into mainstream institutions and create centers. It will require a great deal of tolerance. It will require a great deal of tolerance. Today, I think the world of science has actually become culturally intolerant. They are not prepared to allow another knowledge system. They will allow music to come in. They will allow, occasional talks on, different dimensions of nature. But they will not allow a center of excellence on, let's say, stem cell to work alongside stem cell, which is based on the Ayurveda theory of Kaya Kalpa, which in the literature says that they are able to regenerate not just cells and tissues, but do far more radical changes in the human biology.
Yeah.
Now, we must open our eyes to this, and my argument will remain the same, that just because the epistemology of a knowledge system is different from your epistemology is a complex way of saying way of knowing, it's different, doesn't mean that there are no other ways of knowing. It's a very urgent requirement in modern India if we are to make original contributions. Today we are only following. We are 20 years, 30 years behind every domain because we are following somebody else. If we are to make original contributions, and Dr. M.S. Valyathan has said so, at least in the context of health sciences, he says the only original contributions will come from this so-called domain of Ayurveda biology.
Right. Shankar, I wanted to ask a very personal question. How big is your collection of kurtas?
I try to, I used to work with 4 kurtas, and then as I grew older and, people kept on giving me gifts, I don't buy too many clothes.
Mm-hmm.
The kurtas have multiplied, and now I may be having a dozen kurtas or so. But I keep trying to give them away because I don't need them. I don't need more than 4 or 5 or 6 kurtas, So I try to simplify.
Yeah, I mean, that was the purpose of asking that question, is that isn't it greatness of one remains often is how, to what degree he or she can simplify his or her life.
Yes, I think that is it. It makes life easier to live, really, than tying yourself up in knots.
How would you address the younger generation on Gen Next on being simple yet being proactive and progressive?
I think my advice to people, I'm not sure I'm the right person to offer such advice. But my advice, since you've asked me, would be to really look around. We are too closed in our knowledge institutions, within the walls of, our campuses. We must move around. We must really discover, what is happening in so many domains of life around us. And one can discover many, many challenges, when one looks around and one is not confined to a world that is conditioned. I consider to some extent a lot of reading, conditions you. Because you get conditioned by the thoughts. They may be very profound, but you get conditioned by the thoughts of others. And so I say this is an unconventional advice. I say you should read less and, look more and discover for yourself. You will find many, many challenges in the society. We need to build programs today or social transformation. Of course, this is not something that everyone can do. It is not difficult to be so-called selfless, because when you're doing these kinds of things, you have to give up certain other things, they say. Now, in my view, renunciation is really embracing life. When you are embracing narrow portion of life, you think that is. I'm saying you are renouncing the larger part of life. Renouncement is not giving up; it is embracing more.
Yeah.
What you are embracing is very narrow. So selfless living is a joyous living. It is not a life of giving up. It is a life of accepting, of embracing more.
So it has been a wonderful time. In all together, in 3 parts put together, we probably have conversed for about 4.5 hours, and I still feel its dialogue is incomplete. And therefore, we will continue this dialogue on different occasions, because I think you bring in that conduit between what we are losing rapidly in terms of our traditions, in terms of our rich cultural heritage and the knowledge base. And therefore, my wish is to have ways to clone Darshan Shankar in more than ways. And that would be the best gift to have to a modern age India. But thank you very much for being part of Vishwas in Conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishwas. Thank you.
Hope you have subscribed to this channel, and if you have not, then kindly do subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell button.